All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes, yep, I can hear you well.
All right, I gotta figure out a way to make this window a little smaller. Good. All right, well, thank you very much for the introduction and thank you for inviting me to talk a little bit about the research we've been working on with biochar. So thanks to Cornell Cooperative Extension and Mina and Deborah for helping out. And yeah, I'm excited to tell you a little bit about what we've been finding with biochar and also biosolids in relation to urban trees, specifically tree growth and soil improvement in these landscapes. And I am at University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, but I also want to recognize the Morton Arboretum, where I conducted a lot of this research and still do conduct this research. I'm a research fellow there and acknowledge that institution as well. All right, so let me go ahead and advance. All right, so urban trees, they are under significant stress. Oftentimes urban trees do not live till longevity. This is a urban tree in a subdivision near Chicago and certainly did not live till longevity. This is an oak tree and you can see all the dieback. And many times the problems that are there that are preventing trees to live to longevity are soil problems. Specifically, compaction is a major limitation for urban trees growing in urban soils. This is one we deal with all the time. It's very problematic. It's ubiquitous across the urban environment. Oftentimes you don't see the impacts of compaction until that tree's been on the site for a couple of years, so you've lost some time trying to get that tree established. It's a major problem. And we have other problems, such as when we build urban landscapes, we remove topsoil, we compact that subsoil, we may or may not put that topsoil back on because we're trying to make that substrate suitable for infrastructure. And then at the same time, we might be putting our horticultural plantings like trees in those landscapes. And then on top of that, we have a whole category of unique soils in the urban environment. These are engineered soils. They're engineered specifically to support infrastructure. These are two engineered soils from Boston. You can see they're quite sandy. They have lots and lots of gravel. These sand-based, rock-based structural soils, they're called. They have very low water holding capacities, very low nutrient holding capacities, but they do an excellent job at supporting infrastructure, but not such a great job at supporting horticultural plants like trees. And then we have contaminants all over the urban environment that come in there and also present a problem. This is a picture of some contaminants in Chicago. This particular contaminant I'm highlighting here is salt, which can have a very detrimental effect on urban trees. So we have these urban tree stressors leading to premature death, certainly some reduced health, reduced growth. It's a major problem, and it's one of the biggest challenges that folks that are trying to grow and manage trees in urban environments face. This is a great example of tree stress. This is from one of our research plots in which we can intentionally compacted a soil, planted some trees in there. This tree looked like it was doing great, but you might notice there's a circling root, and that's setting up a situation in which this tree is going to probably fail at some point in the future. It certainly is not going to live to 100 years like we'd want to. So we got a problem. And so how can we use maybe some of these amendments to quote unquote fix these low quality urban soils? That was our question. And we wanted to explore the potential for using both biochar and biosolids for this goal. Biochar, which I'm sure everyone here on the webinar is pretty familiar with now, but the biochars that we used are primarily from woody feedstocks. They're made at pyrolysis temperatures at about 500 to 700 degrees Celsius. And the benefits that we think biochar has potential for soil improvement in relation to urban trees are things like improving the water holding capacity, providing a habitat for microorganisms, providing some structure in some of those compacted soils, and not just providing some structure that might be there for some extended time, given that this is a relatively inert product that doesn't break down that quickly. And then we think there's potential to pair it with other organic amendments such as biosolids. So this is a handful of biosolids that we've been studying in our research. This one happens to be from Downers Grove. These biosolids, there are residual products from the wastewater treatment plant. Here you can see the biosolids drying beds from the Chicago MWRD. And just to give you some perspective on the amount of biosolids that we produce in Chicago, there's a little truck down there, which you maybe can see. I hope you can see my cursor. And there's another truck turning it over there. So a very substantial amount of these things we call biosolids are produced in urban environments. And some of them are making their ways to landfills. Maybe there's a better purpose for these materials. They are relatively high in nutrient concentration. And related to that, the biosolids that we test in our research, they're called EPA Class A biosolids. That means that there's extensive amount of testing that's been done that ensures that they don't have significant amounts of things like heavy metals and other potential nasty things we might be inducing into the environment. All right. So the research that I'm going to talk about now is going to be looking at biochar and or biosolids in combination and examining some of their effects on soil quality, on tree health, on the environment. And then I'm going to conclude with an economic analysis of these products for this area. So we've done about 10 experiments over the last decade or so, and I don't have time to cover all of them. I am going to summarize and just show you some highlights from those bottom 5 that are highlighted here on this slide. And I'm not going to go through all of the results, obviously, because I don't have time for that. I'm going to pull out some key results and kind of highlight them. And then my intention is to summarize what we found in our research in this regard. So our first experiment I wanted to highlight, this is a tree nursery experiment. Here's a picture of the tree nursery. This tree nursery is at the Morton Arboretum. You can see the trees that we have planted there. There's some of the research assistants and volunteers doing some soil collection and some tree monitoring. In this experiment, we've planted 5 different species. You can see the species list there, Acer, Betula, Gleditsia, Malus, and Tilia. And on this soil, I've included the taxonomic soil descriptions. You may or may not be familiar with those. I'm a soil taxonomist, so I kind of obligated to do that. That's an anthraltic haplodelph. It's a soil that's got a lot of clay in it. This is a silty clay loam, and there's some clay movement in it. And the anthraltic means that we've done some significant human modification to it. On this large plot, we've implemented 9 different treatments: a biochar treatment, a biosolid treatment, a biochar plus a fertilizer treatment, a compost, a wood chips, a fertilizer that includes 30-10-7, and also a fertilizer at 30-0-12. And you can see the rate we applied based on a nitrogen rate. And then we've also applied an aerated compost tea, or that abbreviation ACT, at 100 kiloliters per hectare per year. And then we have a control. And this experiment was implemented in 2010, and it's still actually ongoing, but I'll present some of the results that we've seen so far. And you can see in the picture there, there's a Gleditsia plot with some biosolids on it. So here's something that we've saw that's kind of interesting in this experiment. This is total organic carbon in the upper 25 centimeters depth, which is really the area that's been most responsive, or the area that's really been responsive by these treatments. These are all surface applied treatments. And you can see all of our treatments there on this very complicated graph. And just to highlight, I think, the major findings that we've observed so far. So we have, over the first 4 years of this experiment, we certainly have seen a pretty positive and significant results in our biosolids treatment. That's the red bar and dots on this graph, and a significant difference in most years after following that first initial treatment compared to most of our other treatments. And then we have a group of treatments that kind of fall out in the middle, which include our biochar in combination with our fertilizer and alone, and our wood chip and our compost treatments. And then the treatments down at the bottom here in terms of total organic carbon, which tend to be pretty similar to our control, our compost tea, our inorganic fertilizers. And we've been monitoring the soil ever since then. And we certainly, one thing that we've been seeing anecdotally is that biochar is still there. So this is a core that we've taken 7 years after the experiment, and you can see the biochar residual still enriched in the upper surface. So it's not decomposing as fast. And it's something we intend to quantify here 10 years later. And then if we look at what's going on in terms of the trees on this particular experiment, we found that the effects of what's going on in the soil seem to be transitioning into the trees. This is one metric of tree growth. This is relative growth change from 2010 to 2014 in both diameter and height, and significantly greater relative change in diameter and height with our biosolids treatment compared to our control. And all of the other treatments kind of fall in between there. So some really good response with our biosolids. And just to illustrate that, we also did things like measure leaf area. And what I've outlined here is each of the individual trees, and I've shown you the percent growth response in leaf area in comparison to the control with those biosolids, and tried to outline those leaf areas to give you some sort of perspective. And we see some really dramatic growth differences with the biosolids. And I also have one of our volunteers there, Craig, in perspective for each one of those pictures. He was wearing a St. Louis Cardinals hat, which he probably should not have been wearing, so I made him pose for all those pictures. All right, so we followed that experiment up with another one in which we wanted to look at the biochar in combination to the biosolids, and we wanted to look at a couple other things, specifically nutrient leaching. So we designed this pot experiment. These are rather large pots in which we planted Ulmus parvifolia and with and without turf. And we have 3 different soils here, a sand loam, sandy loam, and I'm not going to get into those details. And then the treatments are biochar at 5%, a biosolids at 5%, and a combination at 5%. And then this experiment was run for a couple of years. And we saw kind of similar response in that we see an increase with our biosolids and relative diameter growth. And then when we pair that with our biochar, we see a significant increase in comparison to our null, and even in comparison to our biochar alone. And what we were really interested here is, okay, can we put that biochar in with this biosolids product and prevent the leaching of things like nitrate and phosphate? Knowing that we have relatively high concentration of these nutrients in the biosolids, we're concerned with this potential leaching to the environment. And our hypothesis was that the biochar and biosolids combination treatment, which is the purple bar on these charts, we would see a significant decrease in relation to the biosolids alone. And we did not see that in this experiment in both year 1 and year 2. You can see the purple bars are not significantly smaller in any of the years, in any of either the nitrate or the phosphate when we added that biochar to it. And that might be in relation to the type of biochar and the amount we use, which I'll touch upon when I conclude. Okay, so then on to some landscape experiments. So we conducted one in downtown Chicago in the Bucktown area. So there's a couple of our research assistants doing some tree growth measurements. And in this Bucktown experiment in downtown Chicago, we looked at 4 different species that were in these cutouts, they're called. So they're about 1 meter by 1 meter cutouts, and trees are planted in there. You can see the species listed there. These are highly altered urban soils. The textures are quite variable. They range from loamy sands all the way to sandy clay loams, and some of them have up to 30% coarse fragments. And the treatments that we implemented on this experiment, this was a biochar only experiment, and we implemented at 5% by volume, and that's about 40 megagrams per hectare. We looked at a fertilizer alone, and then we also added the combination of biochar plus fertilizer, and we monitored this for 2010 to 2015. This was a little bit of a challenge to get the biochar into this environment. So what we did is we used this hole drilling method in which we dug with a drill. We put all these holes in there and backfilled those holes with the biochar. I'll show you some other methods that we use to get biochar incorporation. It really varies on the landscape. We couldn't use something like an air knife in this particular landscape because it would have blown the soil all over the place. So this was really the only practical way we saw to get the biochar in. And just some of the results. So here's soil pH and the response in those different treatments. We did have a relatively alkaline environment like we typically do see in an urban environment. And it doesn't appear that the biochar had any effect on that, and we didn't really expect it. The fertilizer did drop pH, and we did expect it. This was a prescription fertilizer that included some sulfur. And when we added the biochar and fertilizer combination, we also see a significant decrease. So in this case, this is a positive thing. We went from an 8 to a 7, probably linked to the fertilizer. We saw that soil organic matter, significant increase in soil organic matter with our combination treatment, and with our isolation treatment of biochar and fertilizer, we don't see any significant differences compared to the null. So that's kind of interesting. It seems like the combination's having an effect relative to those treatments in isolation. And similarly, when we look at the response in microbial biomass, and this happens to be microbial biomass carbon, we actually saw no significant response in either of these isolation treatments. But then when we compare the combination treatment to each of the individual isolation treatments, we see a significant difference. And that null, for some reason, is somewhere in between there. So we're trying to tease out and figure out what's going on here. I will say this is quite a messy system in that there's a lot of variability in the soil textures and what's going on. So it might be related to that. And then looking at the tree growth responses, here we have twig, height, and diameter relative growth changes and the different treatments. And here what we see is the combination treatment appears to be significantly greater in both twig and height growth compared to our null, and then our isolation treatments are somewhere in between. And we've done some modeling to see if there's a linkage between what's going on in the soil and what's going on in the tree. And this is just one of our models. This one happens to include, this is our most significant model, and I'll show you just the most significant models that explain the most variation. This one happens to include the response of soil moisture and pH, and that appears to explain about 22% of the variation, which isn't knock your socks off, but it is significant. All right, let's see if I can, having some trouble with that little, whoops, no, I don't want to do that. Sorry about that. All right, the little arrows are hiding on me. Okay, all right, on to the next experiment. So next experiment was another landscape experiment, and this one was done also in a suburb of Chicago, Bolingbrook, Illinois. And here you can see some landscape pictures of this. This is more of a boulevard environment, a very degraded soil. You can see the nice surface crust on this compacted soil. In this experiment, we looked at 3 different species. These were highly degraded, compacted, silty clay loam soils that were receiving a lot of salt. Here we had a biochar treatment, a fertilizer treatment, a biochar plus fertilizer, a tillage treatment, and then a null. And I'll talk a little bit about the tillage treatment here. So we were presented with an environment that looked pretty much like this, in which we have some pretty compacted soil. And in order to get our treatments into the soil and also hope to help with the structure a little bit, we use this high pressure air knife. And what it does, it shoots into the soil and kind of breaks up that soil a little bit. So here you can see some folks helping out with the experiment. This was in partner from Bartlett Tree Care, helped out with this, and you can see some Bartlett folks helping out there. The Bartlett folks are the ones working, all the volunteers in the projects are the ones standing around looking at them. All right, and then that kind of stirs up the soil, makes it look like this, which you can see there's some pretty good soil structure there. And then from there, we add our biochar as a top dressing and then rake it in. And if we're putting some fertilizer, here's the point we put that fertilizer as well. And the treatment area included that rooting area. All right, so then some of the responses we saw in this experiment, here's soil organic carbon. And in terms of significant responses, we saw that biochar, fertilizer, and tillage, and also the biochar and tillage, we see a significant increase in comparison to our null and our till alone. And then that fertilizer and till treatment, we see no significant difference from either of those extremes. And then if we look at what's going on in the trees, this was not as clear. We had a lot of different species out here and quite a bit of noise. So we actually don't see any significant differences amongst the different years when we look at all the species combined. And that's what this is showing here, but we did see some minor differences when we isolate those individual species. The pattern though that we saw were that biochar fertilizer and tillage tended to appear at the top in terms of relative height growth, relative diameter growth, and other true responses we measured. So it appears to have some success. And then again, when we start to model those things, this model includes nitrogen, carbon, wet aggregate stability, and calcium, some of the soil quality things that we measure as significant model components. And actually we have a reasonably decent model here for an urban landscape system in which we're explaining about 40%, 47% of the variation. All right, and the last experiment I'll talk about is one that we've implemented in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at Three Bridges Park. Here you can see a picture of Three Bridges Park. This is a park that's on a contaminated site, and it's got some really cool topography on the site. You can see it in this poster right here. What they've done is they've tried to mimic the natural drumlins that are very common in our area here in Wisconsin. And they've imported some soil and done some landscaping. And then the vegetation includes bur oak and prairie grasses. And they approached us if there's ways that they could potentially help out with the bur oak growth and health and get them established on the site. So we took that as an opportunity to possibly look at some of these treatments. And there's Jeff and Kim, who are some of our collaborators in this research. So in this experiment, we have Quercus macrocarpa, and we also did this on mixed prairie plots. This is a haplohazard. We got hazardous materials in there. It's a loamy type texture soil. Here we applied biochar at that rate, 25 micrograms per hectare. We also applied biosolids in the form of milorganite. And then we did a combination of biochar and biosolids and a control. And then just highlighting some of those results. This is a project that's still ongoing. I got an undergrad student kind of working up the results right now. And one thing that we found that was significant is when we go out there and dig holes again, we found that the A horizon has been expanding, as you'd kind of expect with these organic amendments. So we see significant increases in the A horizon depth, which is a really, in my opinion, one of the best things that we can monitor for overall soil quality. And we see that A horizon, and we compare that to our null treatment, we've gone from a 6 centimeter to maybe like a 12, 14 centimeter depth. So we've doubled the A horizon thickness in a relatively short period of time. So some rather strong results, I feel. And then did that translate into some improvements in tree health and growth? And it appears it has. So this is an urban tree health index. This, if you're interested, this is the method that is described in Jerry Bond's book. And this is a qualitative assessment of tree health that includes a bunch of different components. And this is just a summary of that urban tree health assessment, but we do see a significant difference with our biochar and biosolids treatment and our biosolids treatment. Not a significant difference between the biochar alone compared to our null. And then we are collecting some quantitative data. This is relative diameter growth and a significant increase in relative diameter growth with our combination treatment, and with any of those treatments in isolation alone do not appear to be effective. And a pretty poor model here in terms of linking below ground and above ground response. Here we just have one parameter in there, A horizon depth, 19%. It's not that great, but it is significant. Okay, so now I'm just going to conclude and try to wrap up some preliminary conclusions that we've found in our research, and just give you some take homes across all of these experiments, the ones that I discussed, and also the first 5 as well too. So we're relatively confident in this statement here that biosolids appear to be quite effective for improving soil quality, tree growth, and health. We are concerned with the potential loss of nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus, with these products. And that tells us that we need to be very aware in terms of loading rates and how much we're putting down there. So some more research has to be done to really identify this application rate that's appropriate for urban trees. We do think that this application rate is probably going to be at around less than 50 megagrams per hectare, less than 5 kilograms of nitrogen per 100 square meters. And we do think that we really should be targeting what the trees pick up. So currently the ANSI, the American National Standards Institute of recommended nitrogen application is 1 to 2 kilograms of nitrogen per 100 square meters. We don't have anything on phosphorus, but we should. The biochar that we tested, and that's an important thing to highlight, did not appear to lessen the loss of NNP as we had hypothesized. And we used some really coarse biochar. This is one biochar we tested in that particular experiment. And I do think that more work needs to be done. Other researchers have found that to be effective to hold it onto nutrients, and it does have a very high absorption capacity. So we do know that they differ in their efficacy. These are 3 different biochars that we have looked at in our experiments. We have this very coarse wood chip. We've looked at wood pellet stuff, and we looked at some finely ground stuff. And we have found different responses. In general, we find in terms of soil health and tree responses, this biochar from these coarse woody chips is really the best. The stuff that we get from wood pellet, this is primarily from energy production, really high pyrolysis temperatures, and doesn't seem to be very good for soil improvement and tree health. So biochars from woody feedstocks is what we've been recommending. We prefer the pyrolysis temperatures to be at 500 or so, relatively lower. And then I always emphasize that we haven't found, and I think others would agree, that biochar is not a fertilizer, and we found it to be most effective when we add a fertilizer with it, either an inorganic or an organic fertilizer like a biosolids or a compost. And then just to conclude, an economic analysis. So we've looked at these different products in comparison to other alternatives that folks are currently using for urban soil improvement. And here we have a chart that breaks down approximately how many dollars per tree per year we spend in materials, equipment, labor, and then the total cost of these different treatments. And the different treatments that we've been exploring in our research include biosolids, compost, just simply watering, wood chips, inorganic fertilizers, and compost teas. And then just to give an efficiency factor, I have also given a mean of grams per tree per year that we might see. And then in terms of efficiency, the growth for the dollar spent. I do think biochar and biosolids in particular, are very efficient treatments. So just to conclude and elaborate, biosolids and biochars are relatively cost effective. The biosolids we use, the reason why they're so cost effective is we get them for free. The biochars that we use in our experiments were actually a little expensive because we had to ship them from across the country. But if we get them locally sourced, that would certainly bring down that cost. And we do think they have some promise, and they have shown some efficacy, and they're worth pursuing. So we've had in these 10 project variable sources of funding that included stuff from Stevens Point, from the Arboretum, the Tree Research Education Endowment Fund. Bartlett's helped out with a bunch of our experiments, J. Frank Schmidt, and Green Site. So I'd like to thank all those folks. And then there's my email address. So if anyone has a question that we can't get to now, I'm happy to entertain email questions as well too.
Wonderful.
So I don't know how fast I went. I feel like I was flying, but I've also had a pot of coffee. So
No, your timing was great. Thank you, Brian. Those were really interesting results. There are a few questions, and then I had a question as well. So I'm going to go first.
Okay.
In your landscape experiment where you use the air knife,
Yep.
you had one chart that showed that tillage, and tillage is when you're just using the air knife, correct?
Yep.
Okay, that it looks like it
decreased.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I think you use the word negatively impacted, but it looks like it negatively impacted.
Yep, and that's a really important thing to note. That you're talking about this one right here, right?
It was the other one, actually, the line graph.
The what?
The line graph, this one. Oh, I think it was this one. Yeah, no, this one. Yep. So it looks like, because the null is the circle, right? So
well, so there's no significant differences in this chart. Okay. So because when I put the letters there, those are mean separations by Tukey-Kramer's test. So if you don't see letters or p-values, they're not significant differences. Okay. But to your point, what we did see though is we saw that this tillage, when you go into a soil and you till it up, you're exposing all that existing organic matter to oxidation and decomposition and breakdown. And I never recommend just going in with the air knife alone. I always recommend going back with the compost afterwards, because you are going to expose some of that organic matter, and you're going to facilitate decomposition. So if your goal is to kind of improve bioaggregation and things like that, you really need to put something back in there as an organic source afterwards too, I think, in my opinion, and what we found in our research.
No, that's interesting, because I thought with, using an air knife, you could at least improve soil structure, but it sounds like you need to add that compost to maintain that benefit that you gained in soil structure, and then to recoup some of the organic matter that's lost.
Yep. So what happens when you go and till up a soil? And this is a great question and something I get all the time, because people will ask me like, hey, I have a compacted soil, I'm just going to go till it up. Well, what will happen is you might see a temporary kind of fluffing of the soil, but the very next year that's going to settle down. And it's actually what you've done in breaking those aggregates up is you've dispersed them. So now you've created a whole bunch of really small little particles that are going to fill in all those little pore spaces again. And now you've actually taken that fluff soil and you've redensified it. And that's what folks have done when they study tillage and or what they found when they've studied just tillage alone and long-term effects in terms of bulk density and compaction. You get that. Yep.
Really interesting. Thank you for for covering that question so thoroughly.
Sure.
All right, so yeah, there's 3 questions for you. Why don't you go ahead and open the Q&A, and I just ask that you read them aloud.
Sure. Okay, so I'll just start at the top from, I won't say, you probably can see my screen, right?
Yes, but the people can't see the Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question is, was the biochar in these experiments inoculated prior to use? It was variable. What we did is, for most of the experiments, we used one biochar because we wanted some standardization. And this biochar was quenched, and then if we were doing like a compost experiment, a compost plus biochar experiment, we would mix it at that point. Okay, and then we would incorporate it back into the landscape.
There's another question associated with that. I don't know if you see the little.
The next one, are you talking about?
It says, yeah. So somebody.
Oh yeah, okay. I see.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, but it was collapsed. Okay, without inoculation, is it still considered biochar? Was inoculant used? Well, I don't. Well, it's been maybe a year since I've gone to the official definition of biochar, but I don't know if inoculation is part of the official definition. You all probably might fill me in on that. But we found that you really do need to have some inoculation. There's this post-processing that's important for efficacy of biochar. The other things that we found important, I kind of hit on those, are in terms of the feedstocks and the pyrolysis temperatures. So, have you tried biochar from biosolids? What are the pros and cons of carbonizing biosolids? Yeah, great question. We have tried that. One of the experiments that I wasn't able to pull up some results just due to time is that we've taken biosolids from, in this case, the Stevens Point wastewater treatment plant, and we made biochar out of them. And then we put that into a green roof setting. And we have found that we have seen some positive responses to some of these green roof plants for that. I will say that when you're trying to make biochar from biosolids, you need a lot of material. It really cuts the volume down very significantly. So, and we were making the biochars ourselves in this little tea lud, and yeah, my undergrad was just, yeah, he was constantly trying to keep up and trying to just get up on the amount of volume he needed. Yeah, so I think there's potential there. We didn't look. I think you're asking in terms of carbonizing, are you maybe changing them, maybe making them hydrophobic or something like that? We didn't explore too much of that, so I can't really speak to that. That was just an undergrad led experiment. Move on and keep me, if I go, tell me when to stop. Okay?
No, you're good. Yeah, you still have some time.
Yep. So question, when you use your aerated compost tea, was it fungal or bacteria dominated? So I've only given you a couple compost tea experiments here. We actually have done close to 20 different experiments on aerated compost teas, and all of the aerated compost teas, when we make them, we do monitoring during the process of making those teas, and then we send off samples to Soil Food Web to get them analyzed, and we also do our own analyses, and we do look at things like fungus and bacteria, and making it for trees. The intention was always to make them fungal dominated, and I think we were successful in that, as successful as we can be. I have lots to speak about compost teas, but maybe if that person wants to contact me, I'm happy to talk more about that. Let's see, have you tried, oh, I just answered that one. Let's see. On the experiment in downtown Chicago where you added biochar by drilling, oh, when people are adding, it's kind of shifting my screen.
Yeah,
wondering
changes it,
why
yeah.
combination of biochar and fertilizer significantly increased organic matter, since the single application of both biochar and fertilizer had not induced any significant changes, and both the biochar and fertilizer are expected to have low organic matter. Yep, I'm wondering that too. So why did we get this response? Maybe I'll go to that one. Oops. I feel like that's about how fast I went through these slides.
Your speed was fine, I thought.
Okay. All right. So, yep. So I think they're referring to this one right here, where we don't see a lot of response in terms of soil organic matter when we look at the biochar alone or the fertilizer alone, but we do see a response when we have them together. And now biochar, you know, we think that this would lead to a higher soil organic matter response, but I think this is related to how we applied this. Okay, remember we had to apply this by inserting in these tiny little holes, and then how we measure it later is we go back with an oak field core sampler and then start poking holes in here, and we take 20 different cores in here, and we may or may not have hit that pocket of biochar. Okay, but what we're looking at here, I think, is actually we've stimulated some root growth, and then that root growth is turning over and it's adding to the soil organic matter. Okay, and we don't see that in isolation of the fertilizer alone. There's not a significant difference between these two. There's overlapping letters, but we think that the best root growth is probably occurring with that combination treatment. Now, we didn't have the resources to actually go out there and measure the root growth, but that's what I would say is happening. I think that we're stimulating something in the trees, and then those trees are stimulating the organic matter cycling. And that's exactly what we want to achieve in these systems. You know, we want to jumpstart them, but hopefully we can have them managed like a forest, in which the natural organic matter restitution is what's feeding the organic matter supply.
Let's do one more question, Bryant. I'm really curious to see your response about the one Jennifer has asked. Do you feel the soil amendments as a biochar liquid products are effective?
Oh yeah, okay. So do you feel the soil amendment as a liquid? Yep. So we actually, that's one of the first things we looked at. Let me make sure. Do you feel that the soil amendments as a liquid, as a biochar liquid? Okay, yeah. Yep. So working with Bartlett, one of the first things we wanted to try and do is, can we get this biochar to a liquid injection? That's often how arborists are applying fertilizers. And we tried to get it down to a powder and get that in suspension, and then actually start injecting that into the soil. And at the time we started doing some of those pilot tests, it was not at all practical in terms of the time that we would have to spend out in the field injecting the biochar via liquid injection to get to the targeted application rates. It was like something along the lines of a full 24 hours to inject on a tree. So, but that was, you know, now holy cow, close to a decade ago. So maybe there's been some technological advances that are there, but that's my only familiarity with that. I haven't done anything other than did a little bit of pilot test to see if that was an option, and we just found it was not at the time. All right. I will say that I like the idea of using these solid materials, because you're providing, you know, a solid substrate to improve the soil structure. Then, you know, some of these, especially like a sandy soil or something that has a very compacted structure in it, putting that biochar in there provides some of that structure and those macropore spaces which we're trying to target.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Bryant. That was really interesting. If you can just go ahead and answer some of these while Emma presents. And if you could just check some of the answered questions as well to make sure I didn't list some as answer live. I want to make sure that I didn't miss, that you didn't miss any as well.
Okay.
All right. Okay, thank you
thanks,
so
everyone.
much. Let's see, Emma, if you want to go ahead and take over the screen.
Sure, absolutely. Let me just share my video and then I will share my screen.
All right, so our next presenter is Emma Schaffert, and she works for Bartlett Tree Experts in North Carolina, and I'll let her introduce more about herself as well. And Emma, thank you so much for joining us.
Brilliant. Yes, thank you so much for asking me to take part in this webinar. It's a real pleasure and it's great to see so many of you joining today. So thank you for giving your time to listen to some of our research findings. I'm really excited to be able to present a few of them today. As similarly with Bryant, I have several different trials that I've carried out over the years, or we have carried out as a company. And I'm just going to touch on the highlights of those rather than delve all of those, and especially those pertaining to the urban environment. So my name is Emma Schaffert. I'm a research technician at the Bartlett Tree Research Laboratory in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am originally from the UK. You probably tell from the accent that I am not a native to North Carolina. I graduated from University of Reading in 2012 and started working at the Bartlett Tree Research Laboratory in Reading in England with Dr. Glyn Percival and the other research technicians there. And then about 2 years ago now, I made the move to Charlotte, North Carolina, and I now work out of that research laboratory. But just to let you know that all the research that I'm referring to today has been done in the UK on 2 different sites. We did do an additional trial on a site in Chelmsford towards the east of England, where we looked at biochar impact on lesion size of a disease called acute oak decline that's impacting oak trees across the UK. But I won't be presenting those that data today just due to time restraints and the topic. So if you have any interest in that, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to share my findings and discuss that further. Without further ado, let's start to talk about why we decided to focus on biochar. And the research question really came about because of the importance of urban trees. And you can see from the nice image on the right-hand side, there are so many benefits of urban trees to human populations, be it through environmental benefits, through impacts on well-being and mental health, or through impacts on oxygen levels and carbon dioxide sequestration. And 54% of the global population live in urban areas. So it's a huge amount of people around the world that are potentially being impacted by these tree populations. But the trees don't tend to reach their maximal benefits until they reach maturity. So as well as planting many trees, many street trees, it's important to promote their health and their survival into maturity as much as possible in these stressful environments. As Bryant mentioned, there are very stressful environments and conditions that are affecting these especially street planted trees, things like compaction, reduced water retention and nutrient retention because of soil quality, and also impervious surfaces around those trees. So they're already in a very stressful situation, both abiotic and biotic conditions. And when trees are planted, they quite often lose quite a large amount of their root area and their root density. They're often damaged during transport or during a lifting process of their bare root trees. And quite often they go into transplant shock after being planted. And then with that combination effect of those stressful characteristics of the urban environment, we do see quite a large amount of tree mortality. And as I said, we want to promote tree survival and them getting to their maturity. On average, the annual tree mortality is between 3 and 5%, depending on the country, the climate, the tree species planted over that first 10 years after planting. So it's quite a large amount when you count the numbers. And how can we improve the soil for tree growth and for survival? How can we improve that soil environment for roots, for root development and root uptake, and to minimize stress on the above ground portion of the drain. One of the things we have investigated for quite some time now is biochar. Biochar, as we've just heard from Bryant, is a pyrolyzed material. It's biomass that's been heated to high temperatures in a low oxygen environment. And the product is very much like charcoal. It's this carbon-rich, highly porous product that we get as a result of this process. And it can be quite a good benefit. We can use waste products to produce this biochar. We can use invasive species, as I'll discuss in a moment. So it's something that it sometimes does have quite a high cost associated with it, but can also be produced from waste materials. And what would make a successful biochar? There's several different factors that would contribute to this. Everything from the biomass or the material that the biochar is produced from, right the way through the production conditions, how we apply and how much we apply, the soil that we're applying to, and then the function that is desired in the soil, whether we want to improve the water holding capacity, whether we want to reduce contaminants or pollutants. And our research really decided to focus on a few of these factors. So the research that we conducted, we've looked at several different feedstocks, so several different biomasses that we produce the biochar from. We've looked at with the soil types where we've applied. There's different trials that we have carried out have been in very different soil types, and I'll discuss those as we progress through the different data that we've collected, and also the function of the biochar in the soil and how that will change over time. So 2 of the trials that I'll be discussing have been 4-year trials. And then the other, which is a containerized trial, has been 2 years since the trial was commenced. So our research focus, as I said, we've decided to look at different feedstocks of biochar, and we've decided to focus on plant-based biochars. So anything of plant origin, anything from agricultural waste, such as rice husk, all the way through pelletized switchgrass sometimes is used to produce biochar. And the bottom right picture there is a species called Vachellia rufescens, and it's known as Nimbian Acacia. And it's actually an invasive species in several countries in Africa. So as I mentioned earlier, several invasive species that are woody, that would be cleared anyway because of their invasive nature and how they take over the rangelands, can then be used to produce biochar through pyrolysis. We decided to look at a biochar with particle sizes lower than 5 millimeters. So we sieved each biochar to make sure that the particles were below that size. We looked at 5% by volume application rate consistently through all of our trials because we had found in different trials throughout the company that was a good application rate to proceed with. We, like I said, looked at different soil types across the different trials. And our main goal for these research trials was to improve plant vitality, survival, and ultimately root development and access to moisture and nutrients and other required elements in the soil. And like I said, we've tried to incorporate some longer term trials to see how the biochar affects the soil environment over time. So here are the 4 main biochar types that we used across our trials. So I will talk about one commercially available biochar that we included in one trial. But you can see there's a wide variation in the particle size initially, which is why we have tried to sieve and minimize that variation. We've got the rice husk, which is an agricultural waste product, the mixed softwood, the Nimbian Acacia hardwood, which is the invasive species I mentioned earlier, and then mixed hardwood. So all of these are commercially available. We were kindly donated them by Carbon Gold, a biochar company based in the UK. And we were interested in comparing the softwood and the hardwood biochars due to the variation in the wood anatomy and whether or not that would affect the porosity of the resulting biochar and therefore the effect on moisture relations in the soil. So we did some initial assessments with the biochar before we went to the field. We examined the plant available water capacity of the biochar when mixed with soil. These were all incorporated at a 5% by volume rate before these analyses were carried out. And you can see that the softwood and the hardwood biochar both significantly increase the plant available water capacity. And what that is the content of the water in the soil between field capacity and wilting point. So the larger that value is, then the more water that's available to the plant in between those two contents. So the larger, the better. And interestingly, we also assess the water repellency, which is that furthest right column, which is labeled as surface tension. And that number indicates how water repellent that biochar was when mixed with soil. We did the same 5% by volume mix for that. And the larger the number, the less water repellent that mixture was. So you can see from those results that the softwood significantly increased the water repellency. It had a lower value than the control. And the hardwood significantly lowered the water repellency. So from these results, we could start to conclude that perhaps water repellency of the biochar in the soil was not going to impact the water available between field capacity and wilting point, which was an interesting finding and something that has been documented in research before. Water repellency doesn't always mean that you're not going to get that water holding capacity that you desire from the biochar products. And then we also analysed bulk density of those samples, and we found that the Nimbian Acacia biochar and the rice-host biochar both significantly reduced the bulk density. All biochars reduced the bulk density, but those were the only two that were significant. The star denotes the significance in those treatments. And that image on the left-hand side is the water repellency analysis, where the surface of the biochar and soil mix was applied with an ethanol solution at different concentrations. If anyone's interested in the methodology for that, let me know. So here is our first site. This is the main one I'm going to be discussing today, which was our urban planted street tree trial. We looked at a borough of London, which is located northwest of the actual municipal London area, but it's still very highly populated, lots of impervious surfaces, and you're going to be getting those stressful conditions like the compaction, the potential for runoff of pollutants and contaminants, and then a higher temperature. We did find higher winter temperatures at this site than at our site in Reading, and lower rainfall. So again, some impact there on the abiotic stresses. And the map image on the right-hand side shows the trial area. So the red outline indicates where the trees were planted within that area, and it amounted to a 5 square mile radius. So it was quite a large area, and we did factor in the different locations into our analyses. I should say as well, the trees for this trial were Magnolia cobus, which is a tree that's quite often planted as a street tree in some occasions in the UK, but is not necessarily suited to that environment. It's not particularly drought tolerant, and it's not particularly stress tolerant for that urban environment. So this trial was started in 2016. We went with the contractors who were planting the trees. They went through the same procedure that they would do when they normally planted trees. We didn't want to alter the process very much. We wanted to keep it practical for a field application, but we added biochar to the backfill when they refilled the holes around the planted tree. So you can see there from the pictures that the planting pit was very small. The soil was not very good quality. There was a high amount of synthetic material in there. There was tarmac. The soil that was there was very clayey. It wasn't a very good condition for root production necessarily, and for nutrient and moisture retention. So after the trees were planted, we monitored several different factors. We monitored root responses. We monitored the crown developments. We monitored different growth aspects of that, stem extension, height to the base of crown spread, many different growth parameters. And we also measured the chlorophyll fluorescence from the leaves of the trees, which essentially is a measure of photosynthetic efficiency. So how efficiently those leaves are photosynthesizing and producing energy for the plant. And we did that over 4 years. So we have data for this trial up until this last year and the beginning of this year. We looked at the same 4 biochars that we spoke about earlier, the 4 plant-based, and then we also included the Carbon Gold commercially available biochar product, which did have amendments mixed in with it in addition, so some worm casts, seaweed, and mycorrhizae as a comparison for the company. And the trees were planted with watering bags, with mulch, with an irrigation tube, with stakes and protection. So they did aim to provide the best conditions for the tree in the first instance. And we did not find any significant differences throughout the growth parameters throughout those years. We saw slight increases in photosynthetic efficiency in the second year across 3 of the biochar treatments. So the tree growth enhancer, the commercial, the hardwood, and the Nimbian Acacia. But other than that, we did not see any real significant differences in those above ground measurements, which was quite surprising. We did expect to see some mortality or some kind of reduction in growth. We did do visual ratings, which I'll mention in a second, which did have some interesting findings. But we did look at the mean root mass below ground. And we do see here that when we analyze the root mass per centimeter cube of soil, so we take into account bulk density, we saw a very significant decrease in the hardwood biochar root mass, which is very unusual. We would potentially think that the root mass would be increased, that there would be greater resources to improve the root growth or to especially fine root growth. But in this instance, we found a decrease. And we found this as well when we analyzed the root mass alone without the factoring in of the bulk density. And one theory that some of my colleagues and I had was that the roots resource allocation was not as high for these trees, potentially because they did not have to search out the nutrients in the water. They didn't have to put on the extra root growth to be able to meet the demands of the tree for uptake. So that was one theory that we have for this trial. And we did see similar in a trial that I'll talk about in a short while. And then moving on to the visual assessment for this same trial, we visually analyzed the condition of the trees. We looked at presence of epicormics, crown size and crown density for the control and all of the treated trees. We used the method set forth by Sepulveda et al. In 2018, if you wanted to look at that methodology. And you can see quite clearly from the graph that there was a large significant increase in the condition rating of the hardwood treated, the Nimbian Acacia treated, and the tree growth enhancer, the commercial biochar treated trees. So quite a significant difference there that we saw in those 3 treatments. The rice husk and the just the rice husk, we did not see such a significant change in those visual ratings, which was not surprising. We didn't see any other significant differences with that treatment earlier on either across the different parameters that we measured. So that was an interesting finding that somewhat supported our finding that if the root growth is reduced, there is no impact on the above ground growth, or in this case, there is an improved vitality or improved condition rating. The second site where we had trials running from 2016 was this Shinfield site near Reading in Berkshire in the UK. This is the Bartlett Tree Research Laboratory in the UK. This is their site. They have several polytunnels and then plenty of field planted tree trials going on there as well. And you can see from the climate data, the average rainfall was a lot higher than the London site. It was an extra 200 millimeters per year. The maximum summer temperature was relatively similar, but the minimum winter temperature was 2 degrees lower. And this is in centigrade, sorry. So actually a lot more in Fahrenheit. And the soil on this site was, the actual field planter trial was a clay loam and was slightly compacted. We did do bulk density measurements as a control. It did have a relatively good nutrient content across the board, but it was somewhat compacted. So it did have a stressful environment from that perspective. But before we go on to the field planter trial, the potted containerized trial that we ran was for 2 years. It was started in 2018, and it was planted with pear saplings. And we decided to look at the impact of only one biochar this time. So we looked at just the hardwood biochar that was one of the best performers in some of our earlier trials. And we looked at that biochar on its own. We looked at the biochar where we pre-soaked it in a fertilizer before we applied. We applied the biochar with a fertilizer drench. We applied the biochar with a water drench, and then we applied fertilizer on its own as well. And this was a liquid fertilizer, I should say, in this instance. And we did see some interesting findings with this trial. So the yellow bars were the total surface area on average of the root system per tree or per sapling. And we did see a significant increase in the total surface area with the biochar that was pre-soaked in fertilizer and with the fertilizer alone, which may be expected. As Bryant said, we do tend to see that biochar preloaded or inoculated or applied with a different amendment can be more effective and should be applied in that manner. And then if we look at the root lengths, which is the hatched bars overlaid there, we did see a significant increase in the root lengths with, again, the fertilizer treatment and the biochar with the water drench, which was unusual. We couldn't really entirely explain that result, but it was interesting to see that the fertilizer treatment increased the root length and the total surface area of the plants, whereas as some of the other biochar treatments did increase the surface area without the root length. So perhaps less resource allocation again there for elongation of roots and more surface area. And here is another summary of those results. So you can see that all biochar treatments increased the surface area, but it was just those two at the top there that were significant. And all the treatments reduced the root length except for the fertilizer. That also increased the length. So some interesting findings there. This is a very short-term trial of only 2 years, and it would be interesting to investigate this with different tree species, different soil types, and also then in the landscape as well. So this is just a containerized trial, but some interesting trends. And then this is the field planter trial that I mentioned earlier. These were 2 different cultivars of pear trees. We planted them in holes again with 5% biochar. We looked at the 4 plant-based biochars that were discussed earlier. And these were in the ground again for 4 years. These were a 4-year trial commenced in 2016. We were interested in looking at the same growth parameters we looked at in the urban planted trees. We looked at heights. We looked at stem extension. We looked at diameter change over time, and we didn't see any significant difference again in that above ground measurement. We also did the chlorophyllescence measurements to analyze the photosynthetic efficiency. Again, no significant differences there, but we did see some significant effects on the root mass. So we looked at mean root mass in 2018, 2019. We also looked at it in 2016, 2017, but we had absolutely no significant differences at that early stage. So potentially across most of our trials, actually, we haven't really seen too much impact on root mass until about year 3 of the trial. And you can see from this graph, the central bars are the no treatment or control, just the soil with no biochar amendment. And in 2018, there were some significant differences in the root mass across the treatments. The top chart on this graph, sorry, I should mention the top chart is the conference cultivar, and the bottom chart is the Doyen du Comice cultivar. So we did separate out and look at the different effects on the different cultivars. And you can see from the top graph that the root mass in the conference was probably the most affected. The conference was the most responsive to the biochar amendments. The root mass was significantly reduced in 2018 with hardwood biochar, Nimbian Acacia biochar again, and the softwood biochar. So very similar findings to what we've reported before. Interesting that then in 2019, we did not see such significant effects on root mass in this cultivar. We only saw significant decreases in the Nimbian Acacia biochar in 2019. So it was just that 2018 data. And then the doyen de Comise, the bottom chart of the graph, we saw a significant decrease in the root mass again in hardwood and Nimbian biochar, and also rice husk this time, and softwood biochar. But then again, in 2019, we did not see the same effects. We saw no significant differences in 2019 on the doyen de Comise. So it would be interesting to go back and look at the climatic data that we collected for these years to see whether or not 2019 was had more water availability that year, perhaps, or less, depending on how the results could be interpreted. So we will be going back and looking at that in further detail, and also incorporating some of the visual ratings that were collected for this trial too. If that should be the, oh, and yeah, we've got the one more slide. So this is again the field planter trial we just discussed, the pear trial. We took soil samples, soil cores from those planting pits where the soil was incorporated, where the biochar, sorry, was incorporated. And we looked at the effect on soil moisture of each biochar type from those samples. And you can see that looking at the volumetric water content, which is the VWC, which is the yellow bars, you can see that there were significant increases in that volumetric water content for, again, the hardwood and the Nimbian biochars. So those two appear to be the most optimal in these cases, in these soil types with these tree species for improving moisture availability and water content in these cases with these biochars. But as Bryant said, there's a huge amount of variation between biochars, the effects between tree species and between soil types. And throughout our trials, we haven't been able to definitively say there is one biochar that works in this scenario. It's very much dependent on the desired function of the biochar in the soil that you're looking for, and also the tree species and the soil type that you're investigating. So that's the end of my presentation. I just wanted to acknowledge Bartlett Tree Experts for their support and many of the staff who have helped with these trials over the years. Also, my PhD supervisors, I'm currently studying for a PhD, so Doctors Glyn Percival, Gillian Rose, and Martin Lukács, who have provided endless support and question answering. So if anyone has any questions for me now, please feel free. I can see there's a few in there.
Thank you, Emma. It was interesting to see the different types of results that you got with the different wood-based biochars.
Yeah,
I've always been curious about the rice hull biochar as well. Rice hulls are used quite a bit here on Long Island for weed management in containers.
okay.
So it's widely used. Okay, so if you want to open up the Q&A, there are some questions, but there's also a discussion going on about using biochar in turf applications. So feel free to add any knowledge that you have to that discussion, either live or afterwards. You can type in your answers as well. But
Okay,
if you start at the top, you can make your way down.
Okay, brilliant. So
here's one from Cheyenne that is directed to you.
oh yes. So Cheyenne has asked, would decreased root mass be a concern for potentially decreased resistance to disturbance? Cheyenne, that's a really good question. And I would say there is the potential for that. It would depend on if the tree was already planted in the landscape and there were not plans to move that tree again, then I would be less concerned for that outcome. But yes, in the production end of the trees and of the plants, that is something that we would consider or would should take into account for definite. I should note that the reductions in root mass that we saw, we did see that more so in the landscape than in the containerized production. We did see an increase in surface area of the roots in the containerized production. So although the root length wasn't as increased in that example, the surface area was, so that would compensate potentially for that reduction in uptake. Hopefully that answers the question.
Do you think that had anything to do about porosity?
Of the biochar?
A porosity of the substrate. So in the containers, you had better porosity versus in the field soil, or no?
Potentially, yeah. So in terms of the bulk density, you mean, so whether the root, would have the area to expand into?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that could be definitely a factor. Although we did see less root length production, even in the containerized trial. So I would wonder if perhaps there was more fine root production to produce that surface area rather than elongation. Yeah, that could definitely be a factor compared to the compacted soils that we were examining in the urban environment, definitely.
And then if you continue scrolling down,
yes,
an anonymous attendee, they're asking about the unit of measurement.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So root mass, that the G -1 just basically means grams. So root mass is just the root weight that we collected from the soil samples. So we collected cores from around the trees. We collected 5 cores per tree, and then we averaged those across the treatments. So that was just a measure of root weight. Thank you for your question.
And then it looks like there's another one from John Webster.
Brilliant. Okay, John asks, are you checking the presence of microbiology and fungi over time? Chemical fertilizers often feed the roots, but not the soils. Do you have data on the term soil health and benefit to tree growth? That's a really great question. And one thing that I didn't actually manage to do within the scope of my research due to resources and facilities available was to measure the biological characteristics of the soil, which would have been something I definitely would have enjoyed investigating more. And you're quite right, the fertilizer effect can often increase that root length and increase the root growth, but maybe not sustainably. And like you say, not improve that soil health over time. So that was something that was quite an interesting finding with this increased surface area, was that potentially that was more sustainable than the increased root length that we saw with the fertilizer treatment. So I completely agree with your comment there that the chemical fertilizers often feed the roots, but not the soils. That's a very good point. Okay. Oh, it's another one from John Webster. So on your engineered soils, you look like you have you looked at what the Stockholm tree project is doing? The organization is extremely influential in the urban tree space. So if you're moving to optimize tree planting processes, that would be very interesting to understand. Yes, I have seen quite a lot of the research being done on the Stockholm tree project. I've been in contact with Bjorn Embrun before briefly. We haven't collaborated and I haven't looked at the Stockholm soil media myself. It would be something that I'd be very interested in. The Stockholm tree soil, from my understanding of it, please feel free to correct me, anyone, but my understanding is that it's a structural soil where there's a lot of large aggregates and larger materials that help to improve the aeration and decrease the compaction. And they then use the biochar to infill some of those larger aggregates. So the biochar, although it is within the eventual rhizosphere of the tree, I don't know if they directly incorporate it with the root systems. I'm not entirely sure, but I think there would be some benefit in using biochar in those situations in the UK and the US. Okay, can't see more questions.
Yeah, I think we've addressed all the questions to you. Emma, are you doing more biochar research in North Carolina?
Not at the moment. So I'm currently writing up my PhD. I'm currently working on my thesis. So that's doing most of my time at the moment. But hopefully that will be the direction I move in.
Wonderful. Okay, well that's very good to know then, and I wish you much success on getting your thesis done there, or your dissertation rather.
Yes. I should mention actually as well that the trials in the UK, one of them will not be being continued, the field planting pear trial, and also the pot trial. But there is the disease trial that I briefly mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and the urban planted trial in London. Those are both still continuing on, and time, hoping that maybe I might be able to get over to the UK at some point after the COVID situation, but hopefully data collection for those will continue.
Oh, wonderful. That's good.
One shape or form.
Okay, so if you want to just review these questions just to make sure that we did cover them all, and feel free to add to any of your answers by typing in your response as well.
Sure.
You can just check over to the answered, because I have moved some of them to the answered section. And then at the end of the webinar, we will kind of revisit with the Q&A, because some more questions may come in.
Brilliant.
Right. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thanks.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to our final presenter. So Andrew, if you would like to take over the screen.
Okay.
So our next presenter is Andrew Borner, and he is the owner of Natural Plant Solutions. And he's going to discuss his experience using biochar in the landscape. All right, we can see your presentation.
Okay, can everybody?
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Can everybody hear me? All right.
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Mina and Deborah, for inviting me to talk about how I've used biochar in my business, Natural Plant Solutions, here in San Juan County and in Northwest Washington. My business, Natural Plant Solutions, is a local business here in Northwest Washington. We promote soil health and we work together with small farmers that are CSA vegetable producers or grazing animals for meat production and homeowners. I do soil testing, soil test interpretation, and then custom nutrient application, both in liquid form with the compost tea base and soluble nutrients, and dry broadcast applications, with biochar being a component in a lot of those. Did I just disappear?
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, something is going on with your presentation. It keeps on fading in and out.
Huh. Yeah, and my
I don't know, you could try Xing out of it and opening it up again. I can grab your PDF. So why don't we try it again? In the meantime, I'll grab your PDF. I have to download it. It's still doing that.
It's still doing it? Huh. Yeah. I don't see that at all.
Let me see. Now, for some reason, it's not doing it. Nope, it just did it.
Okay. Maybe
Andrew, do you have any animations in your presentation?
No.
Okay. I'll let me try and share. Can you see it here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, can you make it go full screen?
Let me see what I can do. Yeah. I don't know how to make a PDF.
You go to view.
View. Full screen. Okay. How is that?
Yeah, I can see that. Yep.
Is that working for you? So I guess I'll kind of just click on
Yeah, sure.
based on
So,
what you're saying,
Or
Yeah.
as best I can.
You can just say next. And
Or
then-
just say next when you're done.
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, so I do custom nutrient application, liquid and dry applications. I also do hydroseeding, where I'm for erosion control, getting bare ground, mostly for, around construction sites and things like that. And then no-till pasture renovation and planting, most recently in the past few years. And I live, in the San Juan Islands in the archipelago, so we can, you can see that I'm riding varies a lot with my equipment. You can go to the next slide, please. So my background, educational background, both as an undergraduate and graduate student, was in global change research, looking at the effect of global change on plant development, nutrient cycling. And so biochar really got me interested primarily in the beginning because of its climate change, climate mitigation story. But to get people, the broader public interested in that, until very recently, in the past few years, that really hasn't been a big decision factor for most homeowners or farmers. Homeowners in our area, our area was previously glaciated, so we've got real variable clayey soils. So if we, using biochar for that sort of situation to loosen up the soils. We also have a Mediterranean climate here, so we're very dry in the summer. And if biochar has been found to help regulate soil moisture into the drying seasons when used in a soil application. So that could be a benefit to homeowners and farmers. And it could also potentially decrease fertilization needs and nutrient runoff into the sound, since we're so close to the water. We're surrounded by water here. And for homeowners, a lot of people around here have nice landscaping, I'm sure, like on Long Island. And that has been a big part of my clientele, dealing with landscaping applications and treating stressed and diseased trees. For farmers, like everyone, cost is a big issue. Biochar use needs to pencil out if they're going to use it in a large way. And so because of these, because the cost of biochar having been a barrier to entry, to use it at the recommended 5 to 10% application rate in soil, I recommend always people give it a try and start using it incrementally in your operation. And that's how I've structured this talk today. So you can go to the next slide, please. So first we'll talk about methods in the beginning where you don't really need any new equipment, and then we'll start talking about some other methods later on that you'll need some larger equipment or maybe some specialized equipment to implement. So you can start off very easily by just trying some biochar and fertilizer blends in your potting soil starts. When you're ready to move on from there, you can use it to implement or amend your some raised beds or some field rows where you have some high value crops or places where you know you need some soil improvement. And then if someone's putting in a new landscape after house construction, like we saw with Bryant's talk in those pictures, in my experience and from his pictures, a lot of the time there's pretty marginal soil that's left after construction. So using biochar is a good idea there. And using it in hydro seeding mix, that's you'll need some specialized equipment there, but adding biochar in with the paper mulch and fertilizer and seed. Using micronite or powdered char in the liquid compost tea and soluble nutrient applications and injecting that into the soil. Adding it in animal bedding and using it in compost and then spreading that back out on the fields. Using a biochar fertilizer mix in no-till planting. We're doing a no-till pasture renovation here in San Juan County. And then larger broadcast fertilizer and biochar applications on farm scale. So starting off small, this is an affordable way to get started. If you're planting some seeds in seed trays at 5 or 10% by volume in your potting mix, you only need 4 to 8 cups to make 5 gallons of amended potting soil, or 1.5 to 3 cubic feet for to amend a cubic yard of soil. So at retail prices, and if you're a farm, you're probably not paying retail prices, but at retail prices, you're paying $40 to $80 for the biochar to make those amendments. But you have to remember that you can probably, as we heard from Neil the other day in his vegetable trials, that you can probably reduce your perlite, peat, and vermiculite use in your potting mix. There's a potential reduction in fertilizer costs by reducing leaching, or so the soil holding on to more nutrients, and an increased growth rate. On the picture on the right there, that's a trial that we did with some flats with a local producer, and that's bok choy. That's that producer's standard soil mix. The one on the right is amended with 5% biochar, and they were both treated once with compost tea and nutrient blend at seeding, and then just watered afterwards. But you can see that they're the same age. There's much more root growth in the one with 5% biochar, and it's a much larger plant. And so if you're doing this, you're adding, admittedly, a little bit over time. You're adding a little bit of biochar out into your garden beds over the years by doing that, but it's a good way to start. So you're ready to do the next step and move up to amending some rows or some high value crops. In the example there below in the middle, that row's 2 feet wide, approximately 28 feet long. And if you're going to amend the top foot, that's about 2 cubic yards of soil. So to make 5%, to make that row 5% by volume, add 3 cubic feet. And you can see later in the season, those tomatoes are about 7 feet tall, and they're kind of ratty looking because I train them out to 2 liters, and then I also prune out some leaves to provide better airflow. But they're loaded with fruit. As Neil said, the biochar increases flowering and fruiting. So that's a benefit there for your high valued crops. You can go to the next slide. So if we amend an entire garden, the 2 pictures here in the middle are at a courtyard, a garden courtyard area at new construction that I just did this summer. It was about 5,000 square feet. They're going to turn it into partially a vegetable growing area and then a permaculture style perennial food garden. And the homeowners here had some very distinct ideas of what they wanted to do, and they were really wanted to add lots of wood chips. They added lots of alder wood chips here, and then we raked in 8 cubic yards of biochar over that whole area. Not all the area got all that wood chips. It's more wood chips than I would have used, but they're going to be, we raked out the biochar nutrients and micronutrients and then tilled that into the soil. And then they planted a cover crop, a soil building cover crop for this season that's going to get worked into the soil before they plant their crops next spring. Could we go back? The slide there on the 2 pictures on the right is also, it's a different site, but it's also a permaculture greenhouse that's getting built. And my role here was to supply the 20 yards of raw biochar. And then they, quote unquote, charged the char, you know, or inoculated the char with a biodynamic compost tea that they produced themselves, and then mixed it in with a 3-way soil, which is compost, sand, and topsoil, and then also a large component of organic chicken manure. But I would recommend if you're planting a perennial situation like the one on the right in the greenhouse, they're going to be planting basically a food forest inside the greenhouse, to do it all at once. And if you're doing a more annual type vegetable garden, you can split it up over time. Debbie talked about this the other day. It's I think you amended some of your Christmas tree trial after the trees have been planted, and that becomes very difficult. So if you're intending it to be soil for perennial plants, I would recommend doing it all at once at the beginning. We can go to the next slide, please. So now we'll move to needing a little bit more equipment. I add biochar in with my regular hydro seed mix. I've got 2 different kind of hydro seed rigs here. I've got a smaller 100-gallon tank that I can have on my 3-point hitch on the tractor, or a 200-gallon tank that's on a skid in the back of the truck. Sort of the standard mix of the paper mulch, the bioturf organic fertilizer, and the granular sort of rice grain and smaller biochar. I add a 5-gallon bucket per 100 gallons of water of the biochar in with my regular mix in the hydro seed mix. And the goal here, we can go to the next slide. My goal here is, because, you know, again, because we're near water, trying to protect our water resources, I'm trying to limit runoff of nutrients. And so anything that we can put in there to help catch that is beneficial. And this is also post-construction bare soil. So adding some organic material with the, you know, with the paper mulch and the biochar, which is going to be longer lived, and adding a living cover crop is what the aim is here. Go to the next slide, please. So now we'll move into using biochar in the powdered form in my liquid nutrient applications with the compost tea base, and then adding that powdered biochar in there with the concentrated nutrient blend. I vary my blend depending on what I'm doing, and I use this compost tea nutrient application for landscaping, vegetable gardens, small CSA farms, and treating stressed trees. And so, depending on what I'm doing, I'm adding a soluble nitrogen source, bat and seabird guanos for phosphorus, soluble kelp, and for potassium and micronutrients, azomite and rock dusts for minerals, and powdered biochar, and beneficial mycorrhizae, especially when I'm treating stressed trees. We can go to and the picture on the right there is that's just biochar, the powdered biochar in a kind of a small tank of water, and it produces, you can kind of makes these cool swirly patterns. You can go to the next slide. So the upper left photo there, that's an example of some landscaping that I deal with. You can see my truck back there with the pump system and hose and the tank. On the upper right there, that's an application that I sort of a test application that I did at a CSA farm here in the islands, and we treated half the bed, and you can see which half it was. It increased survival, it increased growth rate, increased health. Those are all, same age plants, and it had a large effect on that lettuce crop. And again, as Neil was talking about the other day, I find that biochar really helps with branching. Neil found that with his basil experiment. In this peony down here, you can see that it's got tons of buds, and most of those stems have multiple buds on them, and those plants are really disease resistant, I think, because of the compost tea biochar mixture. The picture there on the bottom left is an example of treating a stressed tree. It's basically got parking lot and driveway all around it. This is at a dentist's office. This tree, unfortunately, did not make it, but I put it in here because I think it was a candidate because it's got parking space and severely compacted areas all around it. It would have been a candidate for using those structured soils that the Stockholm tree project advocates, and where you would do some, since this tree is already existing, you could do some light excavation far away from the tree potentially, and then putting in those large stone cobbles, and then washing in a compost and biochar mix so that the roots, so that you can still park cars on it potentially, or have traffic over it, but the roots will still be able to go through those interstitial spaces of those big cobbles and have the medium of the compost and biochar. We can go to the next slide, please. So the next few slides are just going to be examples of some trees and situations that I treat with the compost tea nutrient biochar blend. This is an example of a madrona that an arborist called me to help with. This tree had started experiencing some stress, some die-off, because the homeowners expanded their deck. They, put in some new foundation pillars. The deck was expanded, so it covered up some root infiltration area. And so the goal here is I'm doing injections probably at least 20 feet away from the tree in a grid pattern, and I'm trying to encourage the roots. The roots were damaged where they dug in for the foundation. So I'm encouraging the roots to grow back away from the house. The probe, it's a very rocky area, so the probe tells me where there's actually soil, and so I'm putting nutrients down and trying to encourage with the nutrients, biochar, the biology in the compost tea, and the beneficial mycorrhizae to get the roots to increase surface area and grow away from that disturbance. So we can go to the next slide, please. Here's another madrona tree, beautiful, large, multi-trunk tree. You can see the two trunks on the left are beginning to experience some dieback, and we think it was because the landscaper came in and put about 2 to 3 feet of soil on the left side of the tree and on the right side of the tree for some berms. The homeowner wanted some more screening. You can't really see it, but there's a road behind those trees over there, and they wanted some more screening down low. And so madronas really don't like to get soil piled up over their roots. So we think that this is what the problem was there. We recommended that. They also don't like to get summer water. So we recommended that they take out those conifers. The roots had probably already started growing up into that berm, so we didn't recommend scraping it out, but we came and did a big grid injection. We changed the irrigation so that it wasn't getting too wet in the summertime. And so again, we're just trying to speed up the growth of the roots up into that berm and trying to encourage root growth out into some new areas. Next slide. So people really love their trees. They love them so much that they decide to build their houses around them. And then the arborist gets called when things start going downhill. Here, the arborist called me after they had climbed the tree and taken out all the dead stuff and decreased the sail effect. This tree, or this house, is on a post and pier foundation, so you can get underneath it, but probably 3/4 of the root system of this tree are covered up, and much of it was disturbed. So I am again trying to improve the soil health and get the roots to grow away from the disturbance and into new areas. Here's a project that I was a little worried about. This homeowner planted these maples along this spur driveway a few years ago, and they really weren't doing much. And the driveway obviously is very compacted. On the right side, sort of where the shovel is underneath there, and a little bit further to the right, that's a kind of a bedrock knoll. In that ditch there, that's basically as deep as it can go, just below the shovel there, because that's bedrock, and then it dives down toward the tree. So they just got the tree in there, basically. And so I suggested to the homeowner and that we dig trenches at least 6 feet away from the trunk of the tree, and then amend that soil back in there. This was also kind of a dumping area, I think, from when they built the house. So the contractors put a bunch of stuff in there, very heavily compacted. Well, the homeowner had his own backhoe and started digging before I got back there. And as you can see, their idea of 3 or 6 feet was less than my idea. And so I was worried if there was going to be too much root disturbance here. But we got it, the native soil amended with good quality compost, 10% biochar, and organic fertilizer with beneficial mycorrhizae, and then I injected it with compost tea a couple times after that. And this was done over a year ago, and these trees are doing great now. There was lots of new growth this summer, and things are doing well. Next slide, please. So moving on to needing a little bit more equipment. potentially. You can do this on the small and large scale, but using biochar as a sponge, essentially, in your animal bedding, so that you can catch nutrients that otherwise would run off or be volatilized to the atmosphere. If you're using it in your chicken coop or in your sheep stall or cow stalls, it keeps the bedding drier, keeps your animals healthier, good for hoof health. It also improves the coop and barn air quality. If you spread some biochar into the wood chip bedding of your chicken coop, the ammonia smell will almost go away if you do that every couple of weeks. And then you're capturing, the benefit of that is, if you can smell the ammonia in your chicken coop, that means that you're losing that nutrient source. And so if you can catch it, that's a benefit. And then you put that animal bedding and material from your plant material from your garden. And if you're a bigger farmer, some offal from your on-farm slaughter operations, you can put that into bigger compost piles. And then adding more biochar into your compost pile regulates moisture, which helps speed up decomposition and microbial activity. And so the picture on the bottom there is just a 3 bin. It's about 3 yards of homeowner size compost bins, and then on the right is a larger farm that I work with, and they've already spread most of their compost. That pile stretched all the way to the back there to that second pile. But yeah, they're spreading. This farm is really doing a good job incorporating using biochar in their bedding. They're producing biochar out of their forest, and then they're spreading that compost back onto their pastures, as you can see in the compost spreader there at the bottom. And both of these methods, using it in your animal bedding and compost pile, are great ways to charge your biochar before you use it if you have time. If you make really good quality compost, you can with biochar in it, you can use that in your back in your garden beds or in your potting mix again the next season. So we can go to the next slide, please. Then needing some more equipment in larger scale. I've been applying a biochar organic fertilizer mix in with the no-till seed drill. And I actually got into bought my piece of equipment because I was looking for a way to apply biochar in a more targeted fashion, because a lot of farmers, and understandably, you look at the recommended application rate of 10 tons per acre of biochar, and that's just prohibitively expensive. And so we're not applying anywhere near that amount, but if you can apply a little bit at a time in a targeted fashion with your seed and nutrients, as we saw with Bryant's and other speakers' results, the combination of using biochar and organic fertilizer is a really powerful combination to spur plant health. Just a little orientation on the no-till seed drill if you're not familiar. There's 9 of these planting arms on the bottom of the drill. The no-till part of the no-till drill is that front coulter, which is right in behind that wheel on the planter. That cuts a slice in the ground. Then there's the double disc opener right behind that, and the seed from the front seed box gets deposited right in that double disc opener. The middle seed box gets which it says native grass on it there. That's where I put the biochar fertilizer mix, and that gets deposited in that back tube right behind the double disc opener. And then there's the gauge wheel behind that that you can help set the depth, and then it also acts as a seed firmer to get good seed soil contact. There's 3 seed boxes. The front one I use as seed mix, mostly larger seeds, grass seeds and things like that. The middle seed box again is my biochar fertilizer mix, and then the rear seed box is for small seed, things like clover, alfalfa, bird's foot, trefoil, things like that. And you can deposit things out of those 3 seed boxes all in one pass, and you can adjust the deposition rate for each box separately as well. And the picture on the right is just a picture of the blend there and the agitation in that seed box. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So for this project, I've formed a couple of partnerships over the last few years in the county. The first one for the past 3 seasons with San Juan Islands Conservation District. They have funding from the Washington Department of Ecology and the State Soil Health Committee to implement no-till with farmer partners in the islands. And we've planted at 19 different farms around the county. You can see the map with the different points on it. Each of the partners could have a spring and a fall planting, 2 acres, up to 2 acres each time. Not everybody did it every time. I'm not sure anybody did it every time, but we planted, I haven't done the final tally yet, but we probably planted a little over, somewhere around 100 acres probably over the past 3 years in 2-acre patches. And the different colors there are areas that are the pins with red are no-till sites with where I at least once put down some biochar in one of the plots. Blue is just, they just did seed, and green is they did fertilizer along with their seed. Another partnership just started this year with Brooke Brower at WSU Extension in San Juan County. He started a replicated no-till legume and fertilization trial. And that's at Beaverton Marsh Preserve. It's a land bank property on San Juan Island. But then as part of that, he offered to do test strips, and this portion of the study is not or project isn't replicated, but test strips at any partner farm that wanted to do it this fall. So I did that at 6 farms, and 2 of those farmers decided they wanted to have the biochar fertilizer mixture. So that's an added cost. So not everybody does the biochar fertilizer mixture. But we'll have places to go back to look at the results of using no-till and biochar together. So this is when you get down on your hands and knees, you can see one furrow here in the middle. You can see some legume, probably some clover coming up, and maybe some of the grasses coming up. This is a few weeks after planting, but that's sort of what it looks like. And you can go to the next slide. It's kind of tough because the way historically they've gotten, large scale farmers have gotten no-till to work is they basically nuke everything with herbicide and then mow it real low and then no-till plant into it so there's no competition. We don't want to use herbicide out here. We want to keep being able to use the pastures after a few months of not using the pasture so that the seedlings have a chance to establish. So we are, the management practice that we're advocating is to mow or graze really low, or ideally a combination of the 2. Mow it as low as you can to set the grasses back a couple of times, and then we'll plant into it. We found that fall plantings in our climate have been working the best. But here's a site that did use biochar. In the picture on the left, you can see my feet there. That's looking straight down, and you can see rows going horizontally where the seedlings are coming out, and it's greener because because of the new growth and the biochar fertilizer. And those are every 7.5 inches, there's one of those rows. And then this is the same site. The next spring, you can see the rows of new seedlings there. This was a mix of grasses and a couple different kinds of clovers. We can go to the next slide. So this is the farm that's doing a lot of different things with biochar, producing biochar from their forest and using it in their compost and bedding and everything. The picture on the upper left is right after planting on this ridge top. The picture right below that, bottom left, is a year later, approximately. You can see the infill of new growth, but you can still see the stripes. The upper right is they built a new barn, and there was this disturbed kind of stripe of soil, and this was about 4 months after I planted it. It was planted in October. This picture was taken like January sometime, I think, January or February. And then the bottom right picture is that same area 1 year later. And not every site looks like this, because this site didn't have any competition. It was bare soil for one, but it also got a heavy seeding, it got biochar compost, and it got fertilizer. So it's getting the full treatment. Next slide, please. This is a site where this person runs sheep, and they wanted to add some herbs into their pasture. The herbs are deeper rooted, and they're green at different times of the year, as you can see here. So there's some chicory and plantain that we planted into this pasture. Next slide. And here's a picture of a pasture where we planted. This is also about a year after it was planted. I can tell because I unfortunately couldn't find a pre-picture, but this is about a year after planting. And if you look closely, you can see some stripes out there in the wetter areas. But I tell people that, this is incremental change because we're not using herbicides. We're not using large quantities of fertilizer and biochar. This is incremental change, and it'll take, multiple applications, but we're seeing effects even at these lower use levels. Next slide. So with soil tests, I will do custom nutrient blends, and I get them mixed up by our farm cooperative supplier. And if somebody wants to add biochar in with their fertilizer, our farm co-op does not carry biochar yet, so I have to mix it in by hand on site. And I'm bucketing this fertilizer in anyway, so I add it at about 25% by volume. And I do that just by counting buckets, and I alternate. And it ends up usually being about 10 to 15 cubic feet per acre. So we're not anywhere close to that 10 tons per acre. But if you're doing it a little bit over time, you're doing it on a larger scale, but you're cutting your costs down, and you're just thinking that you're gonna spread that cost out, and you're gonna do it a little bit over time. If you're adding biochar, ask your supplier to get it pretty dry. I mean, they usually put some water in it when they ship it, just so it's not a fire hazard, but ask for it dry, because once you mix it with organic fertilizer, it's gonna get clumpy if it's too wet, and it's a mess. And so because it's dry, wear a respirator, because you don't want to get coal miner's lung. It's dangerous. Even when you're just doing fertilizer, you want to wear a respirator all the time when you're working with this stuff. And we need we really need to, in order to make a difference with global warming and climate change, to use biochar and make significant changes in the way we do things. So if we can use no-till and use biochar and organic fertilizers on the larger scale. This is a no-till seed drill with fertilizer and seed tanks. You know, it's an air drill. It can all be metered in. If it's all GPS driven, so if you put in map information about grid soil testing and you know an area needs more soil carbon, you can up the biochar deposition rate. I don't know that anybody's doing this, but you know, they do this with fertilizer already. So I imagine you could probably do it with biochar. It flows well. This is way beyond my scale, but this is, in my mind, this is sort of the way things need to move. Next slide. So in conclusion, I would say don't be discouraged about cost or scale. You know, get your, like in that bottom left picture there, get your biochar dragon going, and you know, on your own piece of property or your neighbor's property or in your region, you can produce a significant amount of biochar. And also I would really encourage people to keep in mind what your goals are with biochar, and purchase the appropriate biochar material for what you're trying to do. Purchase from reputable suppliers and ask for test results. And if you're not sure what kind of biochar you should be using, you know, talk to them, ask them, and ask researchers, presenters that were at this conference too. And finally, on the large scale, you know, think about your property, your farm, and your region as a system, and use biochar in your gardening and farming operations in different places, so that you're increasing its efficacy by, you know, using it in animal bedding and charging it and using it in your compost. And increasing its use because you're using it in multiple areas. So think of your situation as a ecological system. And I guess next slide, yeah. So if that's my contact information, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. I enjoyed seeing all the diverse applications that you've had with using biochar. It's you have quite a few questions as well. So if you want to go ahead and open the Q&A, and I just ask that you start at the top. And just, you know, if you can, you know, people can see the Q&A, but if you could just read the question aloud, it'll just be easier, and then go ahead and answer.
Sure. So what nozzle specs do you need to incorporate biochar into a spray application? So when I'm doing the soil injection, I'm using a green guard injection probe, and the tip I'm using is just sort of their standard two nozzle tip. So it's got an opening of probably 2 or 3. Each one is probably 2 or 3 millimeters, so it can pass any kind of, you know, particle that's in there. But remember, I'm using a diaphragm pump, and I have a filter on there that is big enough that it will allow the microbes to pass, but not big enough that it basically catches the larger biochar particles and any kind of bigger chunks of my nutrients that I put in there, so it doesn't foul up the pump operation. And I use a Banjo. It's a 1.5 inch Banjo filter, and it's a number 30 screen in there. Hopefully that answers your question. What would you consider a good ratio of biochar to compost for top dressing lawns? Or am I in the lawn situation, or?
You can answer that if you like, but otherwise we can direct Bruce, Debbie and I can direct Bruce to someone to help him,
Yeah,
to
so
help him get an answer to that question.
I've done this a couple times. I don't do lawn maintenance for people, but I do put biochar on my grass. I've got a little patch for my kids. The rest is just field grass. When you aerate, when you plug aerate, I would recommend, I do a 50-50 mix of good quality compost. You know, and it's hard to find good quality compost. I mean, it's almost like if you can find worm castings so that you don't have any big particles, because you want to fill, you want to get the material into those plugs. So, you know, you use a 50-50 mix of fine compost and biochar to do the plug aeration, to fill the plug aeration. We added powder biochar to our hens. Let's see.
Sorry, yeah, what happened when somebody just, I think, upvoted a question, and so it goes to the top and it shifts. So that may have affected what you were just looking at.
Okay, yeah, so I'm back here again. So we added powder biochar to our hens' food, barely any smell. Yeah, so you can add biochar to food. I think if it's the only thing I would caution there, I'm not an expert in the animal portion of this. I know people add it to some of their fermented, you know, bokashi feeds and things like that for their animals. I think in the eyes of the FDA or the USDA, maybe it's not fully approved yet. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I think I've heard from some people that in California it's okay, but you know, if you're selling stuff, you know, I might be careful about it. But you know, for your animals, I would do it. You know, and if they're pecking in their coop, they're going to get it even if it's not in their food. So I think that's fine. Let's see. How many applications do you typically do for stressed trees? One application only. Does it make a difference with type of application, soil drench with hose, sprayer, or soil injection for stressed trees? So I recommend doing multiple applications and multiple applications a year. Usually in our climate, doing at least one in the spring, one in the fall, and then doing that if it's a large, really established tree like the ones I'm treating, you know, do it twice a year for 3 years, and we've seen good effect with that. So people are putting some money into their trees. And then does it make a difference with the type of application, either doing a soil drench or the spray, the injection? I do the injection just so that, you know, you're getting it down closer to the roots, and you're not getting as much I guess evaporation, or I feel like you're just getting more contact with the roots if you can do a soil injection that way. But that's not to say that a soil drench wouldn't be effective. I think you maybe just you might want to water it down more and use more fluid if you're doing it that way. But I prefer the soil injection method. And do you find mulch landscapes near the target plant tree to prevent or become a barrier with absorption rates with the using soil drenching method? Yeah, I mean, if you have heavy mulch around a tree, the roots are gonna, at least the trees we have around here, the roots are gonna grow up into that mulch. mulch does a really good job of holding moisture in, but the top layer of it, it usually is hard to wet, especially in the summertime here. It might be different in an East Coast humid climate, but that's another reason I like to do the soil injection. It just gets down below the surface layer and gets down to the roots better.
So there's that top one. How much do you add to a chicken coop? How much biochar do you add to a chicken
how much? Yeah, so if I have a small chicken coop. I, add, it's about 4 by 8 feet, and I would probably add like maybe 2 coffee cans worth, or something like that, like two large cans worth of biochar every 2 or 3 weeks. And I'm layering in wood chips in with that as well. And that's for 32 square feet.
All right, and then it looks like there's just 2 more questions, and then someone was just complimenting you on your work as well.
So do I do before and after soil microbial assays to get a sense of improvement and to quantify my assessment? I don't. I'm doing, I'm trying to use the best information I can find from conferences like this, and then if something doesn't work, we try something else. But we've been getting good results with treating big mature trees with this method in our area. Do you use your biochar approach as a marketing tool? What is your general sales approach to encourage the extra cost of incorporating biochar? Up until this year, honestly, selling biochar was tough. The cost is prohibitive for most people to buy it on a large scale. Now, just because of my background, I always touted the carbon sequestration aspect of it, but most people's eyes just glazed over. But more and more, just in the past 2-3 years, with the biochar's acceptance in the IPCC, it's a recognized carbon sequestration tool, and then NRCS has encouraged its use in forest stewardship. So it's gaining acceptance, and the carbon sequestration part of it is part of the story. It's becoming it's a stronger, it's a bigger reason of why people are more interested in it now, at least in our area. But really, for growers, the big thing is they want to see results. They want to know that it's going to do something for them. That's sort of the selling point, because it is not cheap.
All right, I think that was our final question. So Andrew, thank you so much for presenting for us this evening, or this afternoon, I guess, for you. And I just want to thank Emma and Bryant for presenting in today's webinar. And I just want to give a shout out to all our speakers that presented earlier. And thank you to all the attendees again. And then last but not least, thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Mina. Thank you, all the speakers. Yeah, no, it was excellent. It was a wide range of information, and I think we covered a lot of topics over these 4 2.5-hour sessions. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. And I think you have contact information of the speakers as well as Mina and myself, and please feel free to follow up. If you do have any questions or you have interest in trying biochar at all, yes, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, we'll be happy to either connect you to the right person to help answer your question, or we'll answer your questions ourselves if we can. Just a reminder, please remember to sign out for any credits. So all you have to do when you sign out is just note your full name and the credits that you're signing out for. So if I were signing out for CNLP, for example, I would just type in Mina Becerra, CNLP, good to go. So again, thank you, everyone. We'll keep this meeting open until 7:30 to ensure that everyone has time to sign out in the chat for the credits. But otherwise, yeah, it's been wonderful. Looks like we have a question coming in. Okay, question was for the credits. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you again, Emma and Bryant. If you're still signed on, feel free to say goodbye if you would like to. Andrew, feel free to say goodbye as well.
Thank you so much for having us. Yeah, it was great.
Thank you. Andrew, I might pick your brain a little bit about the biochar application and a no-till drill. We have a no-till drill free available for loan to our farmers in Suffolk County, and I'm really intrigued by the actual application within the no-till drill. That's really cool.
Yeah, that's a neat way to kind of slice it in through the ground. Yeah, for sure.
And generally on Long Island, growing interest in biochar, especially within the landscape, lots of urban trees, a lot of what everyone said from around the country, it hits home here for us too. So thank you all again. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Emma. And we'll be sending out the recording and we'll send it to you as well. Oh, hi there. Somebody just now I think he's blending into the background. I saw him a little bit back there. Anyway, so we'll be sharing your presentations with all the attendees as well. So I'm sure you'll be getting questions sent your way directly from the attendees too. So thank you all very much.
Yes.
Thank you both.
Good luck on your PhD, Emma.
Thank you very much.
You'll do awesome.
I'll need it.
You'll do great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. All right, so Debbie, I will just keep this on. Oh.
Yep, everyone is good to sign out. Just say your name and the credits you need. Good.
Yeah, looks like.
Great.
Okay, so
thank you all.
They didn't know about the earlier webinars. If you would like us to send you the recordings for the earlier webinars, just shoot me an email or Debbie, and we'll get you those links.
Yep.
All right. So thanks, Debbie.
Thank you. We can hang on a little bit. I think that worked well. We had the backup. We had no issues until the very end.
I know.
Unfortunately.
Why do you think it was doing that flashing?
I've never seen that before. I'm not sure.
Me neither. I wonder if he had a Mac or something wasn't connecting very well to Zoom.
No,
I don't. Andrew. Okay.
Yeah, Andrew still.
I don't know what the problem was, because was it doing that when we did our test the other day?
No,
I'd never seen that.
I did the same thing. I mean, I did the same thing, and I didn't have any animations or anything, or at least not that I know of in my presentation. So.
Well, do you want to try again one more time just to see? I'm curious if it's going to continue doing that, just for testing it.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Did that go big? There we go.
Yeah, I can see it. And
now I don't see any flashing.
Yeah, now it's not doing it. Can you advance it? Yeah, now it's fine. Isn't that funny?
It's weird. I wonder, just the internet, maybe the number of people, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's weird.
In the islands we have decent internet, but there's so many more people here now. I don't know how it is in Long Island, but
oh my God, no.
Many more people here right now. It's crazy.
No, on the South Fork, because all the people left the city and moved to their Hamptons house or rented a Hamptons house, the internet became so spotty. Like the phone service was awful because of that.
I kind of wonder if that's maybe what was going on. I don't know. because it
Yeah.
seems like it's working. I mean,
Yeah.
it was never jiggling for me, but I guess it was jiggling for you. I don't know.
Yep, and some of the attendees mentioned it, so we could all see it, which was really strange. And isn't that funny how, I asked you to exit out and then you entered back in with your presentation, but it was still doing it. But yeah, I'm glad it worked out with the.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's quite all right.
No, but that's why we're glad you sent a PDF of it, so we had the backup
Yeah.
to fill in right away. So
Yeah,
that was
Great.
really great. A lot of the issues you're describing, Andrew, it's the exact same here with the landscape and trees, and people want these immediate, perfect landscapes. And it's also an education factor in this business, I think.
And that picture that you showed of the house built around that beautiful tree.
Yeah.
I know, isn't that crazy? It's like
It was wild.
people, they loved their tree and then they built their house around it, and it's like, well, what did you think was going to happen?
Yeah, they didn't protect it during the construction process. Yeah.
But also that's true. I sometimes forget about the fact that it doesn't get the infiltration from the rain and other things like it naturally would to the roots and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's not just the construction compacting the area, probably it's also the natural runoff and infiltration to the root system.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, and that tree in particular, they damaged a lot of the roots by doing the foundation, but then the house is essentially over 3/4 of its roots. So yeah.
What did you end up doing for that tree? Like how?
Well, it's still there, but who knows if it's going to make it.
Okay.
It's been 4 years now, but since it's on, you can get underneath it. So I was trying to encourage root growth into areas that basically they dug these stripes in to put these big kind of long foundation concrete pieces in. And so in between those, I was trying to encourage root growth, and then basically going out where it wasn't covered by the house, grow out away from the house, basically in new directions. And since it is open, you can kind of crouch underneath the house. It's completely open. It doesn't have a skirt or anything. It doesn't get rain, but I actually told them to put some drip irrigation under there to encourage roots to go back under the house.
That's smart.
I think they did that, for a while. So
Nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd love to talk to you some more about the what we've done with the no-till drill, and because we're not using herbicide, it's some sites work better than others. Competition is a big factor, and then the farmer's management of mowing pre and post seeding, and then keeping their animals off of it for long enough, and then fertilization. I don't know how it is on Long Island, but here a lot of people have their large parcels in ag, but they're not really farmers, and so it's like they've hayed their fields for years and years, but they never put anything back on it, and so a lot of our fields are really nutrient deficient, but very few people actually want to spend the money to make improvements. That one farm on San Juan that I keep talking about, like they have a different situation with the landowner and the farm manager that are really good stewards, and somebody behind it that's willing to put some resources into it, but they're really seeing results. I mean, they've increased the number of animals that they can have on the land just in the last 3 years with doing no-till, compost, and biochar and fertilization. So, doing everything, they're really seeing results, but it's not everybody can do that. So
yeah. Well, I think that would make an interesting talk, Andrew, your whole pasture management experience. So take a lot of pictures this coming season, and we can get you to talk at our Ag Forum next year.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
No, they're definitely growers exactly like you described. They kind of do it as a side business to make some extra money on top of a full-time job. And, you know, they do just kind of degrade the soil over and over. Don't put back into it. So it's difficult, but we're, you know, part of what Mina and I are trying to do is just like your WSU extension, you know, educating everyone about these resources and how they can, you know, have a more positive impact on the environment, and then, you know, their yields and productivity over time.
Right.
And profitability, I guess, tying it back to money. But yeah, it's really great. Really cool to see some of the things they're doing.
Harping on is just you know, incremental change. Try something, do a little bit at a time, and you'll see a benefit, you know. So.
Someone's
raising their hand. You know, I always wonder if, because at the bottom of the screen for the attendee, they have the chat, they have the raise hand, and then they have the Q&A. I always think, are they accidentally clicking on raised hand? So Jennifer, if you...
Oh, she was asking Andrew, what was the ratio of the biochar mix with a 100-gallon tank? I think you said 5 gallons biochar to the 100 gallons water.
Yeah, 5 gallon bucket of biochar per 100 gallons in the hydroseed mix. Yeah.
There's even more questions.
people are listening to our conversation.
I know. What do you? I don't know. What was the last picture of your? So yeah, I think these are a couple of questions for you, Andrew.
Okay. Let's see.
Would you find it a benefit to take soil samples prior to treatment and have a typical chemical and microbial assay lab test done and then repeat in 3 months to see improvements?
You may have to wait longer than 3 months.
I would wait longer.
Yeah, so as part of the conservation district program, they had funding to do soil tests before we did the no-till at these sites. So we did a standard agronomic soil test, and then we also did a Haney soil health test. And you're not, you know, the Haney soil test is I think it's great to do both of those before you start. If you're using organic nutrients, especially, you know, you're probably not going to see a big I would do it every 2 years, maybe every 3 years, but like based on that first soil test, do split applications for 2 years and then test again after 2 years. And we here in the Northwest anyway, we recommend fall soil testing. And so sort of after your harvest is done, see what's left in the soil so you know what you should do for the coming seasons. And so we try to do it at the same time period every year, so that you know, so it's more comparable. So
yeah, so we do have a soil health testing program in the county. We work with our local conservation district and offering that to farmers. So I recommend every 3 years for soil health testing. I recommend soil nutrient testing annually.
Except in ornamental.
But Mina will say for ornamentals.
Yeah,
it
varies
by crop for sure.
Yeah, for ornamental landscape, they recommend every 3 years because, you know, for the most part, it's perennial crops, like for the woody plants at least. But for annuals, especially for like your own personal vegetable garden, you may want to do every year. But for the most part, it's every 3 years for ornamental landscape. Andrew, someone was asking about that picture where you were showing the production of biochar.
Oh, at the end?
Yes. I don't know if they're still on.
I'm wondering if you were
how do I produce it?
Yeah, if we can go to that slide.
Yeah. Let me see if I can. Now
if you click on the presentation, see if that will allow you to go forward.
Oh yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
So the biochar that I want to be clear here, and hopefully I didn't misrepresent this, but the biochar that I am selling, I source from a registered producer. And I use the Black Owl biochar. I think maybe you guys use that stuff too.
I think Neil did.
We have it available.
Oh yeah.
We have it available.
Yeah. So when I sell it, that's what I use. But I make my own biochar just for my own use, and also I'm working towards making a product. But the way I made all this biochar on the right is with these open top kilns and all that. Basically, that's all limbs from just a few big Doug firs that came down. So that's what those branches became, is there on the right.
Nice. All right, I think we got everything now.